Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TBR's webinar, AETs will change the way customers spend their security budgets, with TBR Senior Analyst Jane Wright. I'm Justin Surgett, and I'm hosting today's session. The rise of advanced evasive threats, or AETs, causes customers to reconsider their security solution choices. TBR believes customers will shift their purchasing evaluations from how well does this solution detect malware and advanced threats to how much have black hats learned to evade the solution. From this new vantage point, customers will more likely consider lesser-known vendors or startups with solutions that are not yet widely exposed to the hacker community. At the same time, customers will decrease their spending on established, or vendors that are 3 to 5 years old, advanced threat detection in response technologies such as sandboxing. To address customers' changing requirements while protecting their established market segments, security vendors will adjust their product strategies, creating more offerings and increasing their investments in security startups that specialize in AET blocking. Security vendors will also revise their marketing strategies, reducing their campaigns in areas such as independent testing and focusing on select marketing messages for more granular customer segments. Now, before we begin the presentation today, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the previous we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your thoughts and opinions on what we're presenting today. Please send any questions to the Q&A function, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Finally, we'll send out the slides and the link for the recording for the webinar to everyone registered for today's webinar within, normally it's a day, but we have the vacation weekend, so we'll send them out early next week. You can also find the slides as well as our previous webinar slides on SlideShare at slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. Now let me introduce the analysts presenting today. Jane Wright is a senior analyst here at TBR and leads our security practice. Jane is also lead on TBR syndicated reports, which highlight market trends and competitive positioning, and she manages custom engagements that result in actionable insight for TBR clients. And with that, let me hand this over to Jane.
Thank you, Justin. Hello, everybody. Let me share with you our agenda for today. In our webinar, we're going to be talking about the evolution of advanced evasive techniques, or AETs. We'll talk about how hackers and cyber criminals are using advanced evasive techniques in the malware that they're creating and sending into your customers' infrastructures. We'll look at how the AETs have evolved over time, and then we'll look at how the need to protect their infrastructures against AET-based attacks are causing your customers to change the way they plan their security spending, change the way they evaluate and plan to deploy certain types of security solutions. We'll also look at the areas where we see opportunity for vendors to deliver solutions to help customers defend against AET-based attacks. And finally, because we're talking about new technologies, it always raises up the question of mergers and acquisitions, and so we'll wrap up with a little discussion about mergers or acquisitions that have happened, and I'll even name for you a couple of possible future acquisitions that will happen in this space in the next 12 months. One quick thing I want to mention is that all of my findings and discussion are around enterprise security. And by that, I mean not consumer security. We do follow that here at TBR, but this particular presentation is about enterprise security spending trends. And by enterprise, I mean businesses, of course. So small, medium, and large businesses and very large businesses. And also we include in that ISPs and CSPs and government and defense, basically any non-consumer global customer, and we're going to be looking at their global spending patterns. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with a little introduction to AETs. Now, this is just a very high-level technology look. Mostly we're going to be talking about the business implications. But just to get us all on the same page and using the same wording, I'll talk a little bit about AETs and where they fall in the malware environment. So here on slide number 4, I show you a few different diagrams of the way that I tend to think of attacks. First at the top of this slide, we have malware attacks coming into your customer's infrastructure, which I represent with the blue shields, and they're representing different kinds of security controls. So you look at these blue shields, picture a firewall, an antivirus agent, so hardware, software, virtual, what have you. But those blue shields represent the layers of defense that many customers have deployed for many, many years now that they would consider their preventative first line of defense security controls. So commodity malware is pretty well blocked these days by the first line of defense controls, as you see here in the top of the diagram. The malware is not able to get to the diamond, which represents the crown jewels, or your customer's IP and sensitive data. Crown jewels is also your customer's operations, where the malware is attempting to disrupt your customer's operations. In the middle, we take a look at a diagram of advanced attacks. The line between what's a commodity attack and what's an advanced attack it depends on who you're talking to, but generally we think of advanced attacks as those attacks that are targeted against a particular customer or set of customers, or targeted to get a certain valuable out, and they're designed to bypass those initial preventative solutions in order to get to the customer's crown jewels. So where do AETs fit in? Remember, AETs are techniques, they're not the attacks themselves, but I diagram them at the bottom of this slide. AETs are techniques that are written into the malware, into the code by the hackers, by the cyber criminals. And these techniques are a little different because instead of just trying to bypass security controls, they actually pretty much land on them on purpose and investigate within them. So they land into network security appliances and do some investigation, or, well, I'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but in this diagram I show the advanced evasive techniques kind of buzzing around in the security controls on purpose in order to do some reconnoitering. So here we take a little bit more look. When an advanced evasive technique, which just as a reminder, it's a technique written into the malware, it's automated, when it lands in your customer's security environment, your security devices, or your customer's production machines, so their servers, their endpoints, what have you, these techniques generally do two things. First, they ask some questions. So in other words, they do some queries. And the first thing is they try to find out for the malware, what is this environment I've landed on? Does it look like what I expected, or is this something unexpected to me? So it looks for the files that are running and the processes that are running, because it's looking to see if it's landed in a virtual environment or the actual bare metal environment that it would have expected and that it wants to get into, it wants to exploit it. You know that so many security solutions are based on sandboxing. Sandboxing is when a piece of suspicious code or suspicious file is taken out of the real environment, placed into a virtual environment or a sandbox, and it's opened there, it's explored there, it's detonated there, to do it in a safe place. And then if all is well, it's returned to the normal stream of traffic and allowed to send its file on its way or what have you. So clearly, hackers have learned to come in and look around and make sure they're not in a sandbox, and so they look to see if they're in a virtual environment or a VM. And so they look to see if the files and processes that are running give the appearance that they're in a VM or in a real, true production environment. It also looks at other artifacts of the operating system. For example, making sure if I wanted to land in a customer's server in Brazil, then I would expect a lot of the language of the surrounding programs to be written in, what would that be, Portuguese. So they look for things like that. Then if the malware has determined through these queries that it is in a sandbox or has other reasons to believe that it's come up against some security controls that it wants to evade, it will then take certain actions. And these are automated actions, and they may consist of, for example, changing its traffic structure to look more like allowable traffic, and blend in with allowable traffic. For example, it may change, if it recognizes that this particular email is not going to be allowed through, it might change and try to send it as an IM, for example. It may also do things such as, this is really common, sleeping. If the malware has determined that it's in a virtual sandbox, it'll go to sleep or lie dormant till it knows when that sandbox is timed out. And generally that's because it knows every vendor's sandbox and what their parameters are on those sandboxes. So the timeout, waiting for the sandbox to time out is very common. And then otherwise, it might just make other changes to confuse the security controls that it sees there. Changing its IP address, changing the domain of the server it communicates out to, so it's not so easily identified that it's communicating with a command and control server. Down the bottom of the slide, I show you some very well-known attacks. You recognize all their names. These were things that generally used what we would consider to be evasive techniques to do such a good job of being so effective as an attack. Okay, but so what does this all mean? Your customers are aware of these advanced evasive techniques. They know they're being used, more and more sophisticated techniques being used in the attacks, the targeted attacks, advanced attacks that they need to worry about. They're reading it in the media. They're hearing about it from other vendors and yourselves. And so when they make their purchasing decisions and plan their future strategy, they've got this in mind and they're looking for ways to manage the rise of AETs. And so that's what we're going to look at next. The first thing is that certain segments of the enterprise security market are slowing in growth, in part due to the fact that they have been seen to be somewhat less effective against AETs, that AETs are relatively more able to evade these particular types of products compared to others. And I don't mean that as a blanket statement, but just general feeling, customer perception, sometimes rooted in reality, is that some of these devices and solutions that you see on slide 6 can be evaded by AETs a little bit better than others. And so for that reason in part, we are seeing declining revenues for network firewalls and intrusion detections, or also firewalls with IDS and IPS embedded, included, whitelisting, and traditional sandboxes, first-generation sandboxes, for the reasons that I described to you earlier. It's not to say they're not growing. The revenue is growing, but just slower. So we're seeing revenue in these particular product types growing at 5 to 10% year over year. Again, this is enterprise spending worldwide, 5 to 10%. To put that in perspective, in TDR's benchmark, where we segment all these types of products and we measure their revenues and aggregate it to come up with a market number, aggregate number for the whole market, we're seeing about 12% growth year over year into the next 2 years. So these particular product types are growing somewhat slower than the market's averaged. But let's look at the good news. Let's look at the opportunities for you. Because customers are so aware of the AETs that are helping drive these advanced threats, advanced attacks, they are looking for solutions that help them manage AETs, help them thwart the AETs. And we see these types of solutions falling into 2 categories. Now, basically, these are advanced threat detection and response solutions. Some vendors call them ATP, some call them AMD. We here at TBR call them advanced threat detection and response, meaning they go beyond that first line of defense, commodity malware protection. But basically, these are advanced threat detection response solutions that have AET management capabilities built into them. Some of these work by making the security solution less detectable to the malware. In other words, they kind of camouflage themselves. I give a couple of examples here. in my perspective, I believe that Trend Micro, Deep Discovery, and Dell's AMPD service are examples of this. These are security solutions, and frankly, sandboxing solutions, but they've really come quite a long way in making the sandbox very robust, really mimicking the the customer's actual environment, be it the host environment, the endpoint environment, or the traffic environment, really mimicking that more completely so that it is less visible to the malware that they're in a sandbox. So when the malware lands on a particular, say it lands on an endpoint, it's looking to see that the applications that thought would be running on that endpoint are running, and frankly, it might even be saying, oh, look, here's Angry Birds, but it's really Angry Birds running in the sandbox just to make the sandbox look real. So those are the ones I think of as camouflaging. The other types of solutions that are doing a good job in managing AETs are ones that I just think of as outsmarting the AETs. And these fall into categories such as ones that use machine learning and big data analytics and technologies like that that are able to assess risks, correlate risk, prioritize risk so quickly, faster than humans, that they can get ahead of these AETs that want to go to sleep. So it's really, it's a race. So greatly automated, machine learning, big data analytics driven, they can work very fast and outsmart the AETs in more cases. Also, another way of outsmarting them is simply greater communication between network security controls and endpoint security controls. And we see this with Symantec's MSS ATP solution or service. Part of the issue here, or part of the benefit here, is we see great communication between the network security controls and the endpoint security controls. For example, the network security control may recognize that it's going to allow certain types of HTML traffic. An endpoint security control might recognize that according to its policy, it's not going to allow a SQL file to be emailed out. But if the two of them aren't talking to each other, it's fairly easy for an AET to confuse the issue and slip something by one and then by the other. But if they're greatly communicating with each other, the network and endpoint security, it'll be harder for the AET to outsmart them. And so that's another example, and I only pull out these examples as examples. But there are certainly many other vendors that do have great technologies to thwart AETs also. The good news is that here we are seeing revenue growth rates for these types of solutions at above the market average of about 15 to 20%. But here's the key. A lot of vendors have these advanced technologies to thwart AETs. But it's only the vendors that are messaging them strongly that we're seeing these really strong growth rates. In other words, customers, they want to really be sure they can check that box where they say, this advanced threat detection response solution, does it have AET mitigating capabilities? Yes or no? And it's looking into the messaging and the sales messages and the marketing messages to be really comfortable that this particular vendor with this solution has truly addressed AETs. And so messaging AET mitigation capabilities we see is driving increased revenue for vendors. And this is the more attractive revenue opportunity that you want to get in on. Okay, I promised you some merger, yes, I promised you some merger and acquisition information. And so this is what I have for you on slide 8. We see many security vendors are taking the rise of AETs very seriously as part of the advanced threat landscape. And so some vendors are particularly narrowing their focus of their portfolios so that they can dedicate more resources to the advanced threat detection response solutions, such as those that mitigate AETs. And I'm not saying that they're not continuing to focus their portfolios fully, but they're directing new spending or new investments on development and sales training, et cetera, around these advanced threat detection response solutions. Here are some examples of this. if you were at RSA conference this year, you heard Amit Yoren talk about how RSA will be a very different vendor 1 year from today. Now, he didn't give a great deal of detail, but I believe that part of what this will be is that RSA will ramp up investments around security analytics even more than it has done so already, because RSA sees this as a growth opportunity and a great customer need, great customer requirement. And so we'll see RSA move more investment over to security analytics while perhaps stabilizing or maybe slowing investment in other areas in order to meet the customer's requirements. Another example is Symantec. After it fully separates from Veritas, I believe we are going to see Symantec focusing much of its development resources around its ATP line and letting perhaps the other lines stabilize a little bit more. Well, not all of them, of course. Symantec will also be increasing investments in DLP and things like that. But generally speaking, we do see many established vendors narrowing their focus to focus on this area even more strongly than they have in the past. Other vendors are just leapfrogging ahead real quickly with an acquisition. So a couple of years ago, we saw McAfee acquire StoneSoft, and StoneSoft was arguably the first one to really call out AETs and define them in order to help work against them. And then last year, Dell acquired LastLine, another AET-focused security startup, and that's what's been wrapped into Dell's AMDP service. I believe that in the next 12 months, we'll see at least one more acquisition like this of an established security vendor or possibly multi-line IT vendor with a security segment. I believe we'll see them acquire a startup vendor with an AET mitigation focus. And here on slide 8, I'll give you a couple examples. There's iBoss or WatchGuard. There's certainly many others, but I think we will see activity in this area. And so now I'm going to turn to some of your questions. Please remember you can send in your questions via the chat function. And meanwhile, I'll start to answer the questions that have come in already. Just give us 1 minute while we get our questions together. Got it here, thanks. Okay, first question is, sorry, just putting my speaking notes away. Okay, so someone's asked, what type of customers are buying the different types of security solutions for AETs? So I think what this is that I think this listener is particularly asking about where I talked to that some of the solutions work by camouflaging the security solution and others work by outsmarting it. And so here's what I would say to that. So if you're looking at verticals, no, there's really not a great distinction. Basically, all the industries that are spending aggressively for advanced threat detection response are looking for AET mitigation to be included in that. So that would be your healthcare, your finance, your retail, those kinds of things. However, that said, I would say that there are differences in the customer sizes. We're finding that customers that are small to medium, meaning up to about 1,000 employees, they're particularly receiving well the benefit of security solutions that can camouflage themselves from advanced evasive techniques. Because they don't have that many security solutions installed, relatively speaking, if they're a smaller customer. So they want to be sure that whatever they do have installed is not just being seen and then exploited or worked over by the malware. By comparison, larger customers, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 employees, they have so many security devices and virtual devices and agents and software installed, they're not going to go back and refresh all of those all at once. So they're more interested in the kinds of solutions that help outwit or outsmart the AETs. Also because they generally have more resources, more staff, more skills available to take advantage of the big data analytics that they receive about their security log data or what have you. Okay, so next question. Someone said, why did you mention IBOS and WatchGuard? Do you know something's going to happen? No. So no, I don't particularly know anything is going to happen with those two, but I brought those up as two profiles of the type of vendor, startup vendors that I think would be smart to be acquired in many cases. So let me tell you what I know about them. So IBOS is about 10 years old. They have a product called FireSphere, and they do what I believe is a very extensive job of emulating the true production environment to hide the fact that they're sandboxing. And they've got about 40 million in revenue, and I think about 100 employees. See, in TBR's benchmark, we track this on the vendor, so this is our estimate on them. So they'd be about the right size to be an acquisition. Yeah, I hate to use the word target in a security conference, so an acquisition likelihood. And then I mentioned WatchGuard. WatchGuard is bigger. They've been around about 10 years. They've got about 500 employees. I think they're about 150 million in revenue annual. And what they do is, they have a product, I think it's called Fireware. And what they do is they counter cyber loafing. So the word loafing, like loafing around, hanging around, waiting around, relaxing too much. So cyber loafing is when malware goes to sleep, goes dormant to try to hide itself from a sandbox or from some activity. Another way of saying persistent threat, but certainly this is particularly related to sandboxing or other things where the malware is going to wait for a particular thing to happen, a particular keystroke sequence that might not happen for a year. So that's the focus area of WatchGuard. And again, they just fit the profile of being about the right size. A certain bit of market traction has occurred, but they would still be at the point where their size would not be too cumbersome to integrate if they were acquired by a larger security or IT vendor. Okay, let's see what else. Someone mentioned that they wanted me to clarify regarding Dell and Lastline. Yeah, that may be true. Someone said they think Dell resells Lastline and didn't acquire them. That's correct. I was wrong to use the word acquired. I believe the situation there is that Dell has invested in Lastline and then essentially has a very close and unique kind of reseller relationship with Lastline. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to clarify that. And finally, how does FireEye fit into the AET space? And certainly, FireEye, of course, is one of the key pioneers in advanced threat detection and response. And I would say that FireEye, with MVX and all of the continual upgrades that we see to MVS, FireEye Sandbox, do I dare use the word sandbox? FireEye's multi-vector execution environment. They continue to evolve that and enhance it. And even from what we saw at RSA conferences this year, again, not resting on its laurels. Therefore, customers do perceive that FireEye's HX and NX type solutions are very well equipped to mitigate the effectiveness of AETs. Okay, I think that is it for our questions today. I will turn this back to Justin.
All right, excellent. Well, that's all we have for questions and time. Thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for your questions today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. We invite you to follow Jane and TBR on the Twitter handles listed here, and please check out our YouTube channel for our previously posted webinars as well. And just a reminder, we recorded today's session. We'll be following up with you guys early next week with the slides from today's presentation and the link to the recording. And finally, before you sign off, we'd like to ask you to take a brief survey on today's presentation. We're always looking for ways to improve how the information we share and how we share it. So please take a minute and do that. Otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thanks.